This week on SnarkSquad Pod, we're joined by Sari Riley to talk about the freeform series Cloak Dagger. Welcome back to SnarkSquad Pod. I am your host, Marinez, and with me, as always, is my co-host,
Nicole Sweeney, and we are joined this week by dear friend of the podcast, Sari Riley.
Hi, I'm Sari. I work at Complexly making YouTube videos with Nicole. I'm an editorial assistant on Monstrous, and I co-host SciShow Tangents, a science podcast.
And Sari is joining us to talk about Marvel's Cloak and Dagger. It makes perfect sense because she joined us to talk about Runaways, and this is kind of in like the same sort of vein. If you're following us on Twitter, you maybe remember that a while ago we put up a poll about whether or not we should do an episode on this or Netflix's Dragon Prince, and Dragon Prince ended up winning, but not by a lot. So we were like, okay, well, you know, we have future holes in the schedule where we can do things. So we decided to just go ahead and do this as well. And also we just seem to be making our way through all things Marvel somewhere on SnarkSquad, like recapping the Netflix shows on the blog. We're going through all the movies here. And so making our way through the Marvel teenager universe on the podcast seems to also be a thing that we're doing. So Cloak and Dagger is based on Marvel Comics. I think it's based on characters rather than a specific run. Like I think Runaways was based loosely on the Rainbow Rowell version of the comics. I don't think this is based on a specific iteration so much as it is on the characters themselves. Just feel free to tell us on Twitter if I'm wrong about that, but I think that's the case. The story is about Tandy Bowen and Tyrone Johnson, who are Dagger and Cloak, respectively, of the Cloak and Dagger title. They are in New Orleans, which also is a shift from the comics. The comics take place in New York, but because all of the Netflix stuff is happening in New York, they were like, we should maybe, move them somewhere else. So it takes place in New Orleans, and the series begins with them as children. You see these defining life moments that like radically changed their lives and also probably gave them their powers, though they didn't know it at the time. Tyrone witnesses his brother being fatally shot by a police officer, and his brother falls into the water. They're like at a dock when this happens, and Tyrone jumps into the water after his brother. Meanwhile, not too far away, Tandy is being driven home by her father, who's on the phone talking about like a rig meltdown, having like a work conversation. And so he's super distracted, drives off a bridge and into the same water that Tyrone has also jumped into. Tandy's father dies. Tandy manages to get out. There's like this weird, like brief, you can see stuff going, like mystical, I don't know, foggy shit happening in the water. Unclear what exactly, but probably this is the moment that Tandy and Tyrone are getting their powers. And like also it's what helps them get out of the water and not drown and die. The rest of the series, so we flash, that's like kind of the beginning. From there, we flash back forward and we watch as they are, now in very, very different places in their lives. Tyrone's family has moved into a much nicer neighborhood and he goes to kind of a fancy private school. Tandy, meanwhile, who, had money as a child, now in the aftermath of her father's death, her and her mother are destitute, and Tandy is Tandy's homeless, basically. She's like living out of a church, and eventually they meet, they cross paths, the two of them. That is when their powers like activate. They have not known up to this point that they have anything, but when they come into contact with each other again as teenagers, their powers sort of trigger. And we watch as they sort of figure out how their powers work. Tandy's thing is that she can generate a dagger of light appear at random, and Tyrone can like teleport basically, but with a cloak. He needs something to function as a cloak in order to use his teleportation powers. They also develop other powers related to hopes. That's Tandy, and fears. That's Tyrone. They're discovering their powers and also investigating sort of different mysteries. Tyrone is trying to figure out the cop was never punished for murdering his brother, so he's like kind of trying to get vengeance. And Tandy is trying to figure out what happened with her father and the rig that exploded. And I think that's everything. That's a lot. That was a lot. That was kind of a mess of a synopsis, but I think I covered it all.
Yes. I was going to comment on your synopsis and kind of like the way that the show is built, but I think it's better to kind of start where we always start and ask, not only did you like this, but also if you knew anything about Cloak and Dagger kind of coming into this. I'm curious if you had any basis of knowledge for these particular heroes and their story. And then what did you think of season 1?
I did like it. I think I liked it more than Runaways, which is the obvious comparison of a TV show with teenagers discovering their powers. I just really liked the characters in this, and I thought that both Ty and Tandy had really interesting arcs across the season. I think that the series started a little bit slow for me, where they were establishing the characters, establishing their lives, so much of this story felt like a character drama instead of just a straight up superhero show. And I think to set that up, they needed to show us a lot of where they are in their lives, make us invested in their families and their friends and everything, in addition to having them explore their powers as teenagers and what that means. So it took a little while, but by episode 5, I think, I was invested and ready with all the dream sequences and excited to see where the story went. And before watching the show, I knew nothing about them. I think I mentioned to my dad, who read comics, he was like a classic nerd, I guess, growing up. And so I mentioned that I was watching the show. And this is when I was only an episode or 2 in, and I had lukewarm feelings about it. And he mentioned that he really liked the comics when they were coming out, or he liked these characters in the comics, and so wanted to know my thoughts after I finished the show, because he didn't know that it was turned into a TV show. So I guess I had a positive skew towards my feelings for Cloak and Dagger. But most of what I know about the comics came from after I finished the show. I started reading up on the characters and trying to see where there were parallels or where they diverged. Seems like they took a lot of liberties in this adaptation and made a lot of thoughtful choices to modernize it compared to the comics, which I really like, just in principle.
Yeah, I also didn't know anything about it beforehand. Even my sort of offhanded mentioning, like that I thought it was a fairly, liberal adaptation and not based on anything in particular. It was based on an interview that I read, ? Where one of the writers or creators of the show kind of mentioned that there were some things about the comics that were very of their time in terms of the way that they tried to navigate the fact that you have like a woman and a black man as these superhero characters, but then often defaulted into doing tropey things with them, was sort of the implication of this interview, and that they were like, we don't want to do that now. We want to avoid doing those things. And so that is the extent to which I, know anything about the comics. And that's stuff that I read after finishing it. I also really liked this. I have now seen it twice. I watched it while it was airing, just sort of as a thing to have on, and I really enjoyed it. I was pretty sure that I liked it more than Runaways when I was watching it. I think part of the problem with Runaways is that they were trying to introduce so many characters, and they just wound up never doing any of them particularly effectively. Whereas because they were building this sort of character study out of only 2 characters, like across 10 episodes, they were able to give those stories a lot more room to breathe, and I think it just worked a lot better here. Obviously, there's tons of Runaways comparisons. I rewatched it for this conversation, and I was struck by all of the, not comparisons, but I kept thinking about Sabrina while rewatching it, just because this, like Sabrina, also attempts to tackle a lot of social issues. And just as I think that the comparison to Runaways is very much in Cloak and Dagger's favor, I also think that the ways that it was making me think of Sabrina were to Cloak and Dagger's credit, that it was just like, oh yeah, like look at how well you can introduce this idea in a teenager show. Like I just across the board, those sort of mental comparisons were always in Cloak and Dagger's favor. And I was surprised by how much I enjoyed it on rewatch. I wasn't sure. I was genuinely not sure whether it was going to hold up or be good, just because the way that I watched it the first time was much more passive and I just wasn't as engaged. And so watching it again with an eye towards like, okay, I have to be able to talk about this now, I was, very delighted to find that I still very much enjoyed it.
I loved this. So I didn't have like a moment of like, did I like this? Like, and I get the slow pace at the beginning as well, but I just found it all so great and moody and atmospheric and just really thoughtful that from the beginning, even as they were like feeding us small pieces of the characters in the story, I was in. I had 100% buy-in. I didn't know anything about the show or the comics going into it. In fact, like after the pilot, I was like, this has to be a CW show because of the soundtrack. So I had to like then look it up and be like, oh, it's a freeform show. Like I had no idea where it was airing. I knew nothing about it. And I just found myself like pleasantly surprised. And I think maybe part of it is that I had zero expectations for how the show was going to perform. And so being kind of caught off guard with how much I liked it means that it like extra grew in my feelings. Mm-hmm. And I just really, really enjoyed it. I loved all the characters. I loved a lot of what it was saying. I loved the look and the feel of the show. And I loved that the way that it balanced kind of the character work and their arcs and kind of their mystery with like that sprinkling of superpower on top. So I had a really great time watching this, and it was kind of on the heels of like Sabrina and a few other things that we had done where it was like just genuinely, yes, I like this. Like, no question mark. There have been a few episodes now where we're like, I don't know, question mark. But this one it's like solidly yes, and in my feelings now. So I'm glad to hear that you guys had mostly positive things to say about it as well, because I enjoyed it so much. So, and there's a lot kind of to tackle here, but I guess we should start with the main characters and kind of their stories and their arcs and how you felt about them and the actors and whatnot.
I thought they were both great. Nicole alluded to this in her summary, but in the comics, the way that both these characters were set up, their storylines were switched, so they were more stereotypical. So Tandy was still the wealthy child, and Tyrone was on the streets. And the way that they first met was Tyrone was going to steal Tandy's purse when another robber swooped in, and so then he intervened in that somehow, and then they went to a diner or something and then became fast friends. And so I thought it was really, really interesting that and a smart choice, and made me like the characters and the show so much better to flip that on its head, to start them out as children with Tandy being privileged, Tyrone not so much, and experiencing police brutality and things like that, and then having their situations flipped and having Tandy steal Tyrone's wallet the first thing, where the first time that they meet as teenagers. And so I thought that was just such a clever way to flip stereotypes on its head and ground these characters in more complex backstories than they could have. Mm-hmm. The way that Tyrone's story was tied into New Orleans culture, I wish that I knew more about Louisiana in general, but the way that that was intertwined and the way that his initial cloak was tied into his brother and tied into his father and tied into just so much about community in New Orleans was really fascinating and interesting and made me feel a lot for the characters and this world that they were inhabiting. And I liked that so in addition to fitting in with the world that they established, I really liked how they didn't get along right away, and how the way that they discovered their powers and the way that they built their teamwork was a lot of the time in isolation and kind of being forced together by powers, by these memories or these visions or these dreams that they didn't quite understand. And eventually they accepted that they had to work together, but they were off dealing with so much on their own, and wrapped up in their own lives and their own mysteries, that they could develop a lot as characters independently from each other. So you cared and you understood why they came together during certain moments.
Yeah, totally. I think Mari and I talked about this kind of while we were watching, but one of the best moments of the show, one of the better moments of the show, is the conversation that the two of them have about privilege, basically, in the church. They have a whole chat about, basically that like Tandy's economic lack of privilege and like the racism that Tyrone has to deal with, and kind of like the way that was handled was just so wonderful and good, because like the sort of the beats of that conversation, I don't know, as a sociologist, I'm like, yeah, that's like a very textbook like version of that, but it was narratively so satisfying because of the like you were saying, the sort of very different journeys that we watched them going on, and like the ways in which they were ultimately kind of forced together and forced to like really understand each other. And I really appreciated the ways in which their stories were both individual and also the way they came together. I had a harder time with Tandy. I think she felt a little less, I think in the beginning, she felt slightly less whole and complete to me than Tyrone did. In the kind of the slower, earlier episodes, there were some things that I was like, I don't really entirely understand why you do all the things you do, but okay. But I like eventually got there, and I really, really loved everything that Sarah just said about the way that their stories kind of stood alone, but then they came together to work together.
I also did some research after I finished season 1. It wasn't really research. It was me like, I really enjoyed the story. I would like to see if I could read the comics. And in going back and like reading the different runs and like the synopsis and like where the stories had gone, I was immediately like, no, the show did it better. There was nothing about anything that I had read that was like, wow, I would like to follow that story. Every way that I saw that they had like, they switched it and they put it in New Orleans, and the way that they had switched both of their backgrounds, I thought were just so smart that I don't feel any need to like kind of revisit the story the way that it was. But I think the show did some really great things that like you guys have already mentioned with like tropes and stereotypes, like the way that their backgrounds were kind of flipped from what you would expect in a stereotypical story. And then there was another moment too, which is kind of like not directly related, but they have an actual guy in a freezer at one point. The detective who is kind of helping the kids at one point, she gets involved through investigating an attack on Tandy, and then she kind of becomes a bit of a help for them, but her boyfriend is killed and they literally stuff him in the freezer. And so when I saw the guy in the freezer, I was like, the show, oh my god. Like it's things that are very on the nose, like Nicole was saying, but they're still almost unexpected, and they're done in a way that is narratively satisfying. So you have like the added bonus of it also being a trope turned on its head that is really interesting. But I loved what Sari said about them kind of being in isolation and then coming together. I think part of the reason that this worked so well for me is that it wasn't a story about them necessarily figuring out how to use their powers only. Like you start the story and there were already a series of problems introduced, and they've have all of this like background and like baggage and grief that they're dealing with, and then the powers almost get added into that in a way that mirrors what you've already seen about them. And even when they're separate, there were so many parallels to their story, and even if it wasn't in their story, there were visual things that the show was doing us with light and dark. Again, like very on the nose, but still satisfying. Like a lot of the ways that their scenes were just set up, and where one would be, Tandy had a cut on her palm, and then you would flash to Ty with a bullet in his hand. And so just things that they would like set up that were very parallel that I enjoyed, because it gave a cohesiveness to both of their stories, even when they were developing apart from each other.
You also see that in kind of the cohesiveness and like the way that they were having these mirrors. One of the other things that I wrote down too was the early on stuff with their mothers. And I don't know, this particularly stood out to me on rewatch because you see the sort of visions, the hope, fear visions. You see like examples of this before the audience actually understands what's going on. The audience learns about those powers with them. And so, Tandy's ability to see people's hopes, Tyrone's ability to see people's fears, and early bits where you see Tandy's mom, her like Hope, this is like, I think the first time that we see Tandy do this is with her mother, and her mom, like the flash that she goes to with her mom is Tandy as a little girl, like doing ballet, and her mom is just like both of her parents are like alive and together and there with her, like watching her do ballet as a like happy small child. And then like conversely, you have right around that same time, Tyrone's mother's fear is it's Ty and his brother, who I forget his brother's name, but before his brother died, they're like at the grocery store and they like run off and round a corner and you hear a gunshot, like 2 gunshots, basically. You hear both of them being shot at this grocery store kind of in her head. And it's interesting because you see the ways in which these moments that we're defining in their lives, kind of like its whole families were affected by these instances. And I don't know, but like having those parallels of like, yeah, like this thing that completely shook up your like childhood life. Also, your mothers were adults when these things happened. Right. And like it affected them profoundly too. And I don't know, I just, it was another way that you had these very clear parallels kind of shown, like very different things, obviously very, very different things happening, but like very clear parallels between their 2 stories. Yeah.
I made a note about parents too, because that was one place where it especially contrasted with Runaways for me, was the importance of family throughout this entire story, where it felt like Runaways as teenagers, they were inherently, I don't know, there was a generational divide where the parents felt like they were filling whatever supervillain roles they needed to be to construct the mystery for the Runaways to solve. And it's inherently a harder story to adapt if you're just drawing it straight from the page, because the parents are supervillains and they're evil and you're supposed to make those characters sympathetic somehow. So that's just like a very difficult thing in itself.
They didn't need to make them sympathetic at all.
Yeah.
That's, I maintain that that's where they went wrong.
Yeah.
Anyway, continue.
Yes. And so, yeah, the choices that they made in Runaways to construct the parent-child dynamic and paint the characters however they did made it much more difficult for me to buy in to the family dynamic. Where here, the parents were real humans who are dealing with crises just like their children. And you got to see Tyrone and Tandy as teenagers navigating that space too, where they're figuring out their relationship to parents as they're growing up, as they're coming into their own ideas about the world that sometimes conflict with their parents, or understanding the sacrifices that their parents made or the decisions that their parents made in more complicated ways. And so, like the scenes that you mentioned, Nicole, are really important because they're understanding how much they've been affected by these things, but their parents are equally affected by these things, which I feel like is part of growing up, is you understand that your parents are humans too, and they are flawed and they have problems instead of just being these controlling figures in your lives. And so I thought just the idea of having teenagers discover their powers and also discover their place and their relationship to their families worked a lot better in this series because we got to spend time with them and because everything felt more human rather than supernatural and rather than overtly comic booky.
I think we talked about this when we were doing the sibling stories episode, but the idea of like shared grief and the way that people go through grief differently. And I loved that the parallel that we see, you know, what you said about their different flashes of the hopes and the fears of their mothers kind of just extended out into their stories, because you see Tandy's mother, who is like so mired in that grief that she hasn't been able to let it go. She's like still investigating. It consumes her entire life. She can't hold down a job. Like, she's been very, very stuck in that place. And then you have Ty's parents who don't even want to talk about it. They don't want to talk about what he saw. They don't want him to investigate. They won't even go, like, when it's time to like do the memorial, they don't even want to go memorialize the son that they lost. They're very, very almost like kind of, they're not helping Tyrone grieve in any way. And instead they're pushing kind of almost a perfectionism on him in order to, deal with their grief in that way and kind of try and protect him. So you see, and neither one is right, because obviously, like, Tandy is living on the streets, like, alone, and she can't live with her mother, and she has her own contentious relationship with her mother. But you see the very different ways that, like, their extremes reactions to this grief are affecting their children. And I think it was really neat to see both of those and that entire idea of, like, a shared grief.
I also should mention, I feel like I probably should have said this at the top, but it's, I don't know, worth mentioning that if you are thinking about watching this show, there's, like, content warnings, like, out the ass. There are so many things, like the police brutality, racism, sexual assault, suicide. Those are things that I can think of off the top of my head. Possibly there's more, but yeah, just, something to keep in mind.
Substance abuse,
yes. So in these 10 episodes, I really pack it all in.
I think that was part of what was, I guess, surprising to me. The whole thing, like I said, I was just like, oh, I watched a thing and I had no idea what I was going to watch. But it was almost the tone. It was very dark. And it wasn't without hope, in areas. But just the entire thing was, I think I said moody before, but it was like a very angsty, moody thing. And that's probably why I love it. Like, give me all the angst.
Yes.
But it was like, just visually even, and in the story or whatever, it was very coming, it was definitely coming from a darker place.
I think that's part of the reason I really liked it too. It felt dark in the same way Jessica Jones was dark, where it really affected me and it made me care for these characters so much. So even though I was also surprised by, like, frank discussions of suicide and frank discussions of, I think I wrote down a quote or something from Ty where he said, "This whole country is trying to kill me every day, so you think I can sit around and contemplate suicide?" And having those kind of really dark, really frank discussions about what it's like to grow up being Black, or Tandy discussing drug abuse with her mother or things like that. It went in those dark places, but in such a thoughtful way, and in, like you both have said, a narratively driven way, that I just was super, super invested in it. And even the moments that made me uncomfortable or were supposed to make the viewer uncomfortable, I was sticking through it because that just made me care that much more about their story in the same way. Yeah, I don't know. So it fit thematically with the Netflix Marvel shows like Jessica Jones that also went into very dark places of abusive relationships and assault and things like that, but in a way that didn't feel gratuitous and didn't feel like it was sensationalizing the darkness. And it always had a reason for it, and it gave lifelines to pull these characters out or use them to help these characters grapple with certain problems in their lives, and showed that their lives aren't perfect. And everything wasn't neatly wrapped up in a bow, which I liked too.
The thing about it always having a purpose, yes, which again, not to like keep drawing all the negative comparisons, but like to go back to Sabrina, like the problems with Sabrina, there was a lot of like darkness for darkness's own sake, whereas this was like dark because this is where these characters are right now, and watching them try to find hope, and like it's also just, I don't know, really lovely and beautiful that ultimately a lot of where there was hope to find was in each other or like from within themselves. Like that kind of stuff I think was really great in terms of coming of age stories, which obviously we love. It kind of hit those beats really, really well and effectively. It also made it really great when you had these very subtle moments of humor in the show too. There was when Evita's aunt, I forget her name. They just call her Auntie, right? I don't know if she ever gets an actual name. But the scene before they go do the bath with Ty, she's rattling off all the things that they'll need for this bath, and Ty asks where where do we get all that? Like, we're supposed to go like foraging for all this crap, and she's like, there's a place where you can go to get all these things, and then you cut to a Whole Foods bag, like them coming, and it's just like, it's like this very, like, I don't know, most of the humor in the show is like that, where it's not, laugh out loud, like belly laughter, but there are lots of little like subtle bits like that I think works, like ways of just adding kind of beats of levity in among the like otherwise very, very dark show.
I think Ty has like a very dry personality in general, like in the show, the way that it's portrayed. So there were times that he would just say things that I would also be like, that's not funny, but it's funny. in the pilot, after Tandy steals his wallet and she runs after him, they touch and like kind of blow apart, and he loses track of where she is, and he just looks around and goes, crazy white girl? Like, she's gonna be like, yeah, I'm over here. So there were things like that it was just like, that is not only such a teenager thing to do, like it lent a little bit of that like chuckle, when you needed it most, because things could get very tense.
And speaking of levity, I just want to, I don't know, we've been talking a lot about Ty and Tandy, but I wanted to express appreciation for Nina Hess, who is the scientist that Tandy kind of cons her way into an internship with. The context is Nina's dad worked with Tandy's dad on the oil rig that ended up exploding, and so she becomes a key point in the plot of figuring out what Roxxon is doing, and the eventual climax of the series, which is basically a zombie apocalypse, but locally to New Orleans. But Nina was a really big source of levity for me because she's just so wholesome. Like, I wanted to be her. She's in the woods in like this tree house making cookies, does science for fun, and because she believes that she can make the world a better place and is finishing the work for what she thinks is renewable energy or a better source of energy that her dad started.
Oh man,
and she's just
hearing you describe this, I'm like, oh yeah, that is who Sari wants to be when she grows up.
Yeah, I saw her. I was like, I love you.
Good.
I'll give a shout out to the side character, Avita, she wasn't probably used as much as I would have wanted her to be used, but I loved her moments of like trying to help Ty out, and the way that she kind of tied it into more of that, like the voodoo aspect of it and the history of like New Orleans. And also I just felt like really, I don't know, it was satisfying when Tandy goes into her hopes and tries to steal it, and she's just like, no. And I didn't, it was like not something I was necessarily expecting, but to see like another powerful female, and I don't think she's a superhero, but there's obviously something, powerful and mystical about her. So I really enjoyed her as a side character. I liked anytime she popped up, I was like, yeah. And I would only like to see more of her, and probably a little bit more independence for her in her story, especially if I think that they're going to go in the like romantic route for Tandy and Tyrone. Like, I want her to be doing something. I hope they don't let her go, because she was a source of like, okay, yeah. I mean, probably me looking at her, she's a teenager, so I can't say I want to be her necessarily, but also like cute, powerful girl who's just like, hey, what's up? I was like, yes, you. I enjoyed her on my screen.
Okay, I will say, so I also thoroughly enjoyed her, but to this point of her being a teenager, I was a little distracted by her because the actor who plays Ty, what's his name, Aubrey Joseph, has like a proper baby face, and she didn't. I was like, you're clearly several years older than him. It was like the first like couple times that they were together, I'm like slightly distracted by like what is clearly, I had to like stop and look it up, and she is like 5 years older than him. That tracks, that makes sense. But it like slightly pulled me out of it. But yes, she was great. I loved her character as a whole. The other, so that was one of my like very, very minor, totally insignificant quibbles. The other like two things that I wrote down as moments that I was like kind of pulled out of it. I mentioned that Tandy was a little flat in places. Her "I'm a screwed up bitch" Tyrone line was just like, it was like she had a lot of stuff like that where I was just like, this feels a little bit, this like it's venturing into vaguely tropey territory of like damaged woman, just like, and slightly less, started to feel like flattened stand out and less whole and complete as a character. So there are a couple little moments like that. The other thing that's maybe a slightly larger quibble, minor quibble though, the thematically relevant class lesson was as a moment that was just like our hero does this. Having the teacher like narrate about heroic arcs as we track through an episode. Was something that I was just like I'm here with you. I love me some good teenager drama. But that was a moment where I was like, you've gone a little too far.
I wonder if we all had that same reaction to that scene because we all know hero stories and would already see the show like that, or if I don't know, that was my thought. I also laughed as soon as they had all the voiceovers about this is what a tragic hero is they have to hit a fatal flaw and get to a dark place before they can rise again. Just so on the nose. And then they cut to Ty and Tandy doing the thing that they were just describing.
Right.
But I wonder if that was actually interesting for anyone watching the show who maybe wouldn't pick up on that arc immediately, or if it just feel heavy-handed for everyone. So I also had that quibble, and I can't tell whether it's just like, I know how to read media, so this is just way too much versus
the thing is there is no way that that's not heavy-handed because there's no reason for that to be happening. Like we haven't seen class lessons there's no
ever
there's no other like class integration like other elsewhere in the story. There's no other way for that to make sense other than as like, now we're going to explain the story to the audience. On the flip side, something that I loved that was like that I could see people being not into. I had this moment where I stopped and I was like, do I hate this or do I love this? No, I definitely love this. The fact that the ending, so like we mentioned how dark the show is, it ends. Tandy and Ty save the city. They're like when they realize that, they can use their touching mojo or whatever. I still don't entirely understand how that worked. Doesn't matter. I don't care that I don't understand. It was explained sufficiently for me to be content with it. But Come Sail Away starts playing in the background. And it's like very just like over the top, I don't know, like silliness, I guess, in what is otherwise a very dark show. But I really enjoyed it because the show has been, we watch them struggle with all of these big things, and then like the final moment is them like coming together to fix things. I don't know, and like the visuals of their respective like light and dark powers and all of that. I don't know. I was grinning. I couldn't help but be really happy while I was watching it. So I loved it. I could see somebody not liking it for being too much, but I was here for it.
I think that there was something to be said about because this was, I don't know if complex is really the right word, but this was a story that had like a lot of layers and for the most part some nuance in what it was talking about and whatever. But it felt almost like we earned that moment of simplicity where it was like, let's touch and solve the problem. And you were like, yeah, that's great. Like we've been through so much. You guys have so much going on. Like I'm okay with like the simple ending here, especially because it kind of, I don't know, it felt earned in that way. It wasn't like it was simple after simple and then it ended in a way that you were like, okay, that was all too easy. So I enjoyed that moment as well. And I already mentioned the music, but I super noticed the soundtrack. All of the songs they were playing were always right on the nose. And I was like, yep, I love it. Like I don't even care. Like it was just part of the experience and of like that angsty teen, like moody, like of course you have the appropriate soundtrack playing on the back of this. Like that was perfect.
Yes.
Not to fixate on the ending, but I also really liked how it felt folkloric, and like they were part of the legends of New Orleans again, because throughout that whole episode, you get cut scenes of every single pairing on Evita's aunt's mantle. And so we get the story of, I don't even remember, it's like the two Native American children who saved the city from famine, or you get the Revolutionary War soldier and I don't know, some other girl who lived in New Orleans who carried the message to end the final battle. Maybe it was Civil War. And so you get throughout that episode, like the story of all these pairings of people who have saved the city. And so, and they kind of allude to them too, because Tyrone gets a slash on his arm because I think Evita mentioned that one in the pairing is always marked, the one who has to die. And then that whole scene where Tandy bumps against the radiator or pot pipe or something, and so she gets marked too, and then they hold hands and then they save the world. I just thought that really fit with the stories of myth and legend of saving the city.
Yeah.
And so that helped make it extra satisfying for me too, because we were told of all these really almost supernatural stories that happened where two people saved an entire city. And so this is just another instance of it in the modern way with these powers. And so that, I don't know, it felt so good because of that. And it felt like they were part of a bigger narrative too, besides just having this moment together and having this moment of happiness and saving the world that needed to end this kind of dark series.
I'm with Nicole in the fact that there's a lot that we don't understand about their powers yet, and I don't care because we had so much like backstory and other things going on. But I'm curious what you guys thought about their powers overall, because they're really strange. They're just, it's not like your typical like super strength and flying. Like she can do a light dagger. They can see hopes and fears. He like swallowed his the cop at the end, and then after reading you learn that one of his powers is like banishing his foes to like the dark verse, like he can literally disappear people. And then you have that whole like sidebar where Tandy is like stealing people's hopes and like getting high off of them. So it was all of these little pieces that they kept introducing, and it just kept getting weirder, and I was like okay with it though, like, because it, you get oversaturated, I think, with like superhero stories and like the basic like kinds of powers. So it's very interesting to see something that every time that they showed us something new, it wasn't something that I was necessarily expecting.
Yeah, I think that's the key to just the fact that it was like always kind of like a little bit surprising, but then also it always served some sort of larger purpose, that like, yes, Tandy's stealing people's hopes also was a way of like her powers reflecting her addiction that she she had problems with addiction before her powers activated. So her stealing people's hopes was a way to like link her powers to things about her, which was something that they were doing kind of throughout, right? That like their powers and who they were. They have a conversation really early on after they have discovered their powers, where they talk about how, Tandy says like if she could, disappear and go anywhere, like she would be gone in a heartbeat. And Ty says if he could make a knife of light, the cop would be dead by now. And like they say, that like maybe that's why we have what we have and why we don't have what we don't have. And they kind of keep exploring that throughout, that's sort of like a running theme of the season. And I think that the malleability of their powers in that way just plays a lot better because this is like a teen drama, I think in a way that like the grittiness of the Netflix Marvel shows, I don't think you could get away with it in the same way that you can here because of all of the coming of age stuff that they're also grappling with. So I think, I don't know, it just worked. It's something that I could see being a problem for people because there's potentially some consistency. I don't know. I think it is consistent though. Like it tracks. Like there is a sense that you can make of all of the things, but for sure the fact that they kept introducing new things, I could see that being a problem for people. For me, it worked totally.
As someone who is generally pretty annoyed when things aren't consistent or when the rules of a universe are bent and broken, I liked it. I liked their powers. I liked the confusion with the first few episodes where they were discovering their powers. It felt like I was right along there with them, where they would touch someone and get a vision, and you weren't sure whether that was a memory. You weren't sure if that was like mind reading of some sort. You weren't sure before they started establishing the hopes and fears and that these were entirely hypothetical situations. You didn't really know what they were seeing in the same way that Ty and Tandy didn't really know what they were seeing. And I agree that the powers felt consistent within the general themes of like hopes and fears. And so any new aspect of their powers that they threw in felt like it fit with Ty and Tandy discovering those powers on their own, discovering that they were, I don't know, like the supernatural elements of the show, the fact that this energy source at the bottom of the lake that presumably gave them their powers in the first place with that blue wave of light, because I think that was the same effect that they used when like employees were working at the pipes and then got blasted with something and then became I forget what word they were, zombies. So yeah, I don't know. That was a very long-winded way to say I also liked it and was excited to see what else they would find out about their powers and the way that they would not understand them or not be able to control them or abuse them. And I was just on board for all of that.
I think I mentioned like more for Evita as like a season 2 wish list thing, but definitely more of like their powers. And I think the developing collaboration between the two of them and like what is Cloak and Dagger, because I still don't know, like even having read like all of it, I'm not sure like what are they very superhero-y, or do they work together, or what the show is going to decide to do with all of that. So I'm excited to see that kind of stuff in season 2, and I hope they don't drop the parents entirely, even though we ended the season kind of almost flipped from where we were before with like Tandy pulling closer to her mom and, you know, Ty having to run away from home and being cut off from everybody, and now being the one living in the church and whatnot. So it's going to be interesting. But do you guys have any other things that you would like to see kind of going forward from the show?
All of those things. This is like not at all a season 2. This is just, I don't know. Long term, I want to see the Runaways run to New Orleans. That's what I want.
Yes.
I want crossover magic. Or they can all run away. I mean, Tyrone can't be in New Orleans. Like, you know, that's fine. Like, they could all run away somewhere else. That's a possibility. Mostly, I think the Runaways should run to New Orleans just because New Orleans plays such a big role in this show, whereas like LA is kind of irrelevant to Runaways.
Yeah, I would like for them to stay in New Orleans too, in the same way that the Netflix Marvel series are so New York centric. I feel like Cloak and Dagger has interwoven itself with New Orleans so well that this should be Cloak and Dagger's domain. Like, this is the city that they feel bound to and that they want to protect. I don't know.
Yes,
superheroes have codes, moral codes. So
Ty did have that whole speech about like protecting. He was directing it towards the cop, which was a really great moment also, where he was just like, you're supposed to protect us. But I think that idea of like being part of New Orleans and protecting that city is so closely tied to the story, like you're saying, that I think they have to stay there too. Hopefully they do.
Yeah. Couple other things that I wrote down that I really loved that I just want to mention before we finish. I loved that Evita's aunt was so like sex positive, that like after Evita and Ty sleep together, she's like totally nonchalant about like the sex and is more interested in she can sense that like Ty is part of the pairing, whatever. That's the conversation she wants to have. It's a very small moment, but I appreciated that it was there. What else? Oh, also to the point about all of the angst in the show, I think it's end of episode 6 after Ty sees his brother's friend get murdered, that like he's in the church and he's having all the feelings, and Tandy's sitting there, you know, like a foot away from him and can't like hug him, which is clearly all you want to do in that moment. And that was, I don't know, the angst, moments of deep angst. And then, also as a like rewatch thing, the cop who ends up dead in the cop who ends up getting fridged, he warns the New York cop off. You know, he's like, Connors is flammable, stay away from Connors, very, very early on. And then he winds up dead because she doesn't listen to that advice, which is a moment of foreshadowing. Also, we didn't even mention the New York cop. She has a bit at the end where she's maybe going to be a villain, maybe going to be, she's now powered at the end of the season. During the kind of epic events of the finale, she has a confrontation with the bad cop who killed Ty's brother. Bad cop kills her and she falls into the water, which we know is full of, magic energy. And she's presumed dead, but then in sort of classic Marvel credit scene fashion, we see her dragging herself out of the water and her eyes are glowy and her movements are very twitchy and stuff. So I looked it up. I forgot already what the character's name is, but she's like a comic book character of some sort. And so I don't know. I'm interested to see what exactly they do with all of that.
I think Mayhem. Mayhem is
there. You go.
Is the name? Yeah.
It's like a vengeance power of some sort.
It'll be interesting. I think to see if it ends up being I quit watching the show partway through, but Arrow is Team Arrow, and he has he's a superhero, but he's got the whole team built around him. If that ends up being kind of a thing, because between Evita and now the New York cop turned Mayhem, are there going to be a group of them coming together, or what? How is that going to kind of evolve?
From the little that I read about that character, what her character is in the comics, which again, who knows what they'll how closely they'll track all of that. So a chaotic character that kind of in the vein of something along the lines of the Punisher, where it's good but question mark, but maybe bad. Good. And so I don't know, I'm curious to see what they'll do with it.
I have a list of other things that I wanted to shout out as well. The bit at the end where the cop comes out of the water was one, but also the scenes where they end up going to Mina's father and going into his coma state, and Tandy gets kind of stuck in a loop of talking to her father on a phone. I thought was really, really emotional, and just seeing her go through that. And when Ty gets back and he's like, "How long have you been here?" And he just, she doesn't want to leave. She has the opportunity to keep listening to her father on the phone one last time. I thought that was just really well done, and I think that whole coma loop zombie thing was very strange, but I liked it. So it was also a moment that really stuck with me.
The last thing that I want to shout out, if we're going to do little things that we noticed, I remember when Luke Cage first came out, there was a lot of the biggest tweet or social media or commentary on it was, it's such a powerful image to see a black man in a hoodie be bulletproof. Be shot by guns and be bulletproof. And I thought that they used the hoodie really, really well in this show. The fact that, premise is Ty as a child would wear his older brother's hoodie and was wearing it at the time when his brother was shot. And so he jumped into the water with it. When he washed up on the beach with Tandy, he was wearing it, but then she stole it from him and ran away with it. And you see her wearing it in the church in the first couple episodes.
As a sort of security blanket.
Yeah. As a warmth and comfort. And then Ty's cloak throughout the middle part of the series, where he's first testing out his powers, is a beaded cloak. I don't know the significance, but it's his dad is part of some sort of community. There's some cultural tradition of making beaded garments and cloaks that Tyrone's dad was inducting his brother into, and then invited Tyrone into later on. And so he picks out his brother's old cloak that was unfinished and finishes beading it, and then wears that to control his powers. But it gets ripped up during the zombie attack in the police station, and eventually brings Ty and Tandy back to the church, and she gives him his brother's sweatshirt again, and that hoodie becomes the source of his powers during that final episode. That's the cloak that he uses to teleport and defeat the cop in the dark way that he does, and things like that. And I just thought that was really powerful imagery, that this object that is tied in with grief and tied in with so much imagery of Black children being shot was used as a symbol of power, and is now the source of his strength and power too, and came full circle in that way.
I really like that. I didn't know if I liked the cloak thing, especially because Tandy doesn't have something, to parallel that. She just kind of could use her dagger kind of more on command. So I was a little, questioning of the cloak in general of like, why can't he do it without it? But I really like in that perspective and just kind of the cultural moment that we're living in. So you have converted me. Yes, cloak.
Yes, cloak.
And on that note, we've reached the end of another episode. Thank you so much to Sari for joining us this week, and thank you all for listening. We'd love to hear all of your thoughts on Cloak and Dagger. There will be a post dedicated to this episode up on SnarkSquad.com. You can also join our community on Patreon at patreon.com/SnarkSquad. There we have polls and bonus content. You can also find us on Twitter at Snark_squad. You can find me at My Name is Marines.
I am at Sweeney Says.
I'm at C.E. Riley.
Thank you as always to Stefan Chin for the fancy theme music that is playing us out right now. And we will be back in your podcast feed next week. Bye.
Bye.